So first, I'm going to give a brief introduction on red blood cells. So erythrocytes or red blood cells have a 7 to 8 micrometer diameter, and they have a biconcave discoid shape. And they make around 500,000 passages through the human body during their lifespan of around 3 to 4 months. And in this lifespan, they travel around 300 miles. So this middle graphic shows that they can pass through the human circulation in about 20 seconds. And their primary function is to deliver oxygen to cells and pick up carbon dioxide and remove it from the cells. So erythrocytes are born in the red bone marrow in a process called erythropoiesis. After they mature, they become fully developed erythrocytes and they enter into the circulation. And after about 120 days, they enter the spleen and they are destroyed in a process called erythrophagocytosis. Here are some visuals showing this process. So essentially a macrophage is ingesting the red blood cell for destruction. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper now into erythrophagocytosis. So as I said before, this is a process in which red blood cells are phagocytosed by macrophages in the spleen. And this is activated when a certain threshold of myosin 2A is present. So myosin 2A, some of you may know, is a protein that's involved in the contraction of muscles, but in macrophages, it triggers the phagocytic action of the macrophage. So it causes the macrophage to engulf the red blood cell. And there are multiple species that influence the activation of myosin 2. And they're shown in this visual here. So we have CD47, which binds to the SERPA on a macrophage. And this triggers SHP1, which sends a do not eat me signal to myosin 2A. So this prevents phagocytosis from occurring. Then there's also CD47 present on the red blood cell surface. CD47 alt, and this is a form of CD47 that changes its conformation as a red blood cell ages. And in this conformation, it binds to SERPA with the assistance of TSP1, which is a protein in the blood. And in this instance, it triggers the activation of myosin 2A and enhances the phagocytic response. Then there's also band 3, which is a surface protein on the red blood cell. And with the help of anti-band 3 and naturally occurring antibodies in the blood, it binds to an Fc gamma receptor on the macrophage and triggers myosin 2 activation. Then there's also phosphatidylserine, and this is present on both the inner and outer membranes of the red blood cell. But as a red blood cell ages, it gets more exposed on the outer membrane, and it binds to PS binding receptors on the macrophage, which enhances myosin 2 activation. Then rigidity of the cell also plays an important role, because as red blood cells age, they become far more rigid, which overstimulates myosin 2 activation because they mechanically allow a better formation of the phagocytic cup. So they're more likely to be phagocytosed if they're more rigid. So in summary, we have 3 major eat me signals. The PS axis, which is basically as phosphatidylserine increases, there's an increased likelihood of phagocytosis. The band 3 and anti-band 3 and naturally occurring antibody axis. So as more band 3 is present, the phagocytic response is increased. The TSP1 and CD47 alt axis, as it binds to SERPA, it increases the phagocytic response. And we have the do not eat me signal of CD47 bound to SERPA, which prevents phagocytosis from occurring. So this process can be modeled using 15 ODEs, and this is on modeling the concentrations of the 15 different chemical species involved in this model. There's 23 parameters in this system representing binding rates, activation and deactivation rates, and phenomenological states. And the aim of this work is to be able to recover the parameters in the species dynamics given some noisy data. So first, we set up to determine the structural identifiability of the ODE model. We assume that data is given for 9 of the 15 species, so we assume that they can be measured experimentally. And we also assume 11 of the 23 parameters to be known, so these can also be obtained from experimental data. Based on the structural identifiability, though, 4 of these parameters are non-identifiable and 8 of them are globally identifiable. So they theoretically should provide a single solution when we determine the results of this model. I'm going to briefly go into the architecture of the neural network. It consists of 2 layers with 50 neurons each. And
Achilles, sorry to, can you go back to the previous slide? People, I don't think people know what globally identifiable versus locally versus. Can you make a comment?
Yeah. So a globally identifiable parameter, when you run it through the neural network, this parameter will have one unique solution. A locally identifiable parameter, it can have several different solutions that will yield the correct result. A non-identifiable parameter, though, it may yield various different solutions based on the neural network, and it will not change the results of the ODEs being calculated.
And can you give an example of like a globally identifiable parameter? If you can go back, let's say K14, yeah. That's involved in which equations?
Yeah, so K14, we can see it in so K14 is involved in the equation for X11, and yeah, it's only in X11.
No, it's K in the 14 species. Probably it's only, yeah, 14 species and the 12 species. K14, oh yeah, K14, yeah. And then, oh yeah, you're right, yeah. Oh yeah, on the only one, okay, so the K14 doesn't go to the X14 species. It's not numbered like that, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yep. And so, as I was saying, the neural network has 2 layers with 50 neurons each, and the loss function is based on 3 losses noted as data loss, ODE loss, and auxiliary loss. So the data loss is essentially a calculation of how far off the predicted value is from the actual data point. The ODE loss is a measurement of how far off the predicted value is from the ODE value. And the auxiliary loss is essentially part of the ODE loss, but it's specified as the initial conditions. So it measures the first 2 time frames of the ODE. An atom optimizer was used, and the parameters are all multiplied by a scaling factor prior to the training phase. And it goes through 100,000 iterations. So the problem statement is, assuming the previously specified parameters in the data are known, what can the PIN learn about the globally identifiable parameters in the unknown species dynamics? So to answer this question, we examined 4 different cases, and just to rehash, the data is given for 9 of the 15 species, and parameter values are known for 15 of the 23 parameters. This includes the 11 parameters we initially assumed to be known, and it also includes the 4 non-identifiable parameters, since these would not be able to be predicted by the PIN, so they would have to be measured experimentally. And the 4 cases studied are 100 seconds of data without noise, 100 seconds of data with 5% Gaussian noise, 180 seconds of data without noise, and 180 seconds of data with 5% Gaussian noise. So first, the reverse problem was done to use the biopin to estimate the parameter values, and this was performed 10 times for each of the 4 cases. And then the forward problem was done to use the estimated parameter values to generate the species dynamics and see how closely they line up with the actual dynamics. So this is the 100-second noiseless case. So first, these are the 15 different graphs for each of the ODEs. And the curves with dotted lines on them, these are the curves that we were assuming the data is given for. So for X1, for example, this data was given to the PIN, but for X2, the data was not given to the PIN. So the unknown dynamics are recovered accurately for most species in this case. Even the unknown dynamics are predicted almost exactly by the PIN, like X2, X6, X7, X12, and X13 all follow the curve very closely. But there is a larger issue with predicting X3, and the predictions are sometimes overestimated and sometimes underestimated. And the parameters are recovered accurately. These are K9, K11, K14, K15, and K23. And this is determined by relating it to the average relative error. So these have the lower average relative errors than the other three parameters here. Now, when we add noise to the trial, we see that the undue dynamics are still recovered accurately for most species. In some cases, like in the case of X4, X5, X6, and X7, we see that there's a bit of a tail that forms after around 60 seconds due to the presence of the noise. But the main dynamics are recovered very accurately. X3 still has a large issue in uncovering the dynamics, and the parameters are not very identifiable because of the noise. So only K14 is practically identifiable and has the lowest average relative errors, while the other parameters have average relative errors of around 100% or higher in some cases. Then we did the 180-second noiseless case. And as before, the undue dynamics are recovered accurately. There's still an issue in predicting X3 as seen previously. And the parameters are recovered accurately again. And these are K8, K9, K11, K14, K15, and K23. So there's still difficulty in predicting the values of K16 and K17 for the noiseless case. Then when noise is added, we see that the unknown dynamics are still fairly recovered well, but there is some issue after around 75 seconds that it starts skewing off in the positive or negative direction for X4 through X7 again. And X3 still has difficulties in being recovered accurately. And the noise makes practical identifiability difficult in this case. And only K14 is practically identifiable again, as it was for the 100-second case with noise. So some conclusions we can draw from this work are that while 8 parameters are structurally identifiable, only K14 is practically identifiable. And another conclusion we can make is that accurate prediction of the dynamics is not strongly dependent on the parameter values. Even with the noise and high average relative errors for the parameters, the dynamics are recovered accurately for most species, and only X3 has difficulty being recovered. This is probably due to the initial conditions having a larger impact on the prediction of the ODE. And now I'm going to talk a bit about the future work involving this model. So currently this model can accurately recover species dynamics for red blood cell clearance of a healthy individual. And we want to see if it can do the same if the parameters in the initial conditions are patient specific, like in the case of someone with sickle cell disease. With sickle cell disease, red blood cell clearance is greatly enhanced due to how the disease affects the red blood cells and the concentrations of certain species in the blood. So patients with sickle cell disease often require numerous blood transfusions since the rate of blood clearance is so high. And the effect on red blood cell clearance can be captured by the system of ODEs by modifying the parameters in the initial conditions that we have. But before we do this, we need to generate realistic sickle cell disease specific data so that we can feed it to the biopin. And the following features are changed in the assessment of the effects of sickle cell disease on red blood cell clearance: phosphatidylserine levels, CD47, rigidity, and TSP1. And we also examine changes in SERPA. So first, I like to explain this graph that's presented. So the phagocytic index is a measurement of the likelihood that any single red blood cell will be phagocytosed by the macrophage. And the anti-serum level, it's a measurement of how many antibodies are present in the blood. And this can be used as a basis because the antibodies assist the macrophage in binding to the red blood cell and will increase the rate of phagocytosis as seen in all of these curves. As the anti-serum level increases, the rate of phagocytosis increases. So for phosphatidylserine, in sickle cells, it's expressed far more commonly than it is in healthy red blood cells, and its values can be between 10 times to 100 times as much as in healthy red blood cells. And when PS expression is even double, there's a notable increase in the rate of phagocytosis. For example, when NAB levels are around 2, then the phagocytic index is 20% for a PS value of 1. But when it increases to 2, it's around 35%. And when PS expression is increased to 10 times as much or even 100 times as much, the rate of phagocytosis is roughly 100% for most anti-serum levels. Now for CD47 expression, sickle red blood cells express far less CD47 on their outer membranes than a healthy red blood cell. And this can vary between 10% to 67% less. And the 47% less case is when the sickle cells are in a state of hypoxia or when they're deprived of oxygen. And as we can see from the graph, the rate of phagocytosis increases as the amount of CD47 decreases. And notably for sickle cells in a hypoxic state, the phagocytic index is much greater and is roughly 100% for all anti-serum levels. Then sickle cells are far more rigid than healthy red blood cells. And this is because their structure changes due to a lack of oxygen. So they kind of collapse and form a crescent sickle shape. So their rigidity can be between 2 times to 100 times as much as that of a healthy red blood cell. So once again, as we can see from these curves, higher rigidity leads to a higher rate of phagocytosis, with the higher levels of about 5 times to 100 times more rigid, having a 100% phagocytosis rate. And for TSP1 expression, as I said before, TSP1 is a protein that floats around in the blood, and normally it's released for wounds and for blood clotting. But in patients with sickle cell disease, they have higher levels of this protein, and it can be between 1.27 to 4 times the level of a healthy red blood cell. And higher TSP levels increase the rate of phagocytosis again, as it's varied from 1 to 4. And the reason why these curves are so much higher than the curves in the other cases is because this trial had to take into account the presence of CD47 alt, which appears in aged red blood cells and binds to SERPA with the help of TSP1. But in the other cases, we do not measure the effects of CD47 alt. And lastly, I'd like to go over SERPA expression and its effect on the phagocytic index. So decreased SERPA binding to CD47 would weaken the do not eat me signal that's sent by CD47 binding to SERPA. And SERPA is varied between 70% to 95% the normal levels to examine its effect on the rate of phagocytosis. And we see that lower levels of SERPA can cause an increase in the rate of phagocytosis. So the standard case where SERPA 3000 is down here, and then it's about 20% for an anti-serum level of 2. And then when it's decreased to 2,100, we can see that it's almost 100% for all of the anti-serum levels. And this is just a slide presenting the initial conditions of the sickle red blood cell case with the varied initial conditions. And that just includes the CD47 measurement. And this table shows the sickle red blood cell parameter table with the varied parameters. And these include TSP1, PS, and rigidity. These are the references I used, and thank you very much for listening to my talk. If there are any questions, I'll answer them to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Achilles. Questions for the speaker?
Thank you, Achilles. First of all, let me just say that September is the national month of sickle cell anemia. So this is very timely. I think Matthew has a question.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. My question's about the first part of the talk. And I'm curious about the parameters were not identifiable in the noisy case, practically identifiable. And I'm wondering if that's an optimization issue or like really an issue. So for instance, is the loss function lower at the parameters that you found than it would be at, say, the true parameters?
We did some work into seeing how we could change the identifiability, and we saw that if we use different cases where different equations were assumed to be known, the identifiability would be far better than it is in this current configuration. I'm not sure if it's an issue with the optimization or the loss function though. But I think that changing the basis case of the given data would affect the identifiability and provide a better result.
Can you elaborate on that? So I guess I want to distinguish between the sort of structurally identifiable and when you got, reliable estimates from data. So I'm asking about the second question. Even though a parameter might be structurally identifiable, you might have really high error in recovering it.
Yeah.
So was your question, your answer about the second thing or about the first thing?
I think I was trying to answer both, but I'll try to be more clear. I think that actually, could you repeat your question? I don't think I fully understood.
Yeah, so a simple way would be if you gave the loss function, suppose you were doing simulated data where you knew all the parameters.
Yeah.
If you gave the loss function the true parameters, would it be lower than the parameters the optimizer finds? Meaning that there's the optimizer just got stuck in a local minimum, and if it could search the space better, it would have found the more accurate parameters.
I don't think it's an issue with the optimizer being stuck in a local minimum because we changed the weights of the different losses, and we also tried different optimizers like ReLU and other ones, and it didn't yield different or better results. I think one of the main influences though is the initial conditions being a part of the loss function and the auxiliary loss, which would help predict the dynamics better, even though the parameters would not necessarily be practically identifiable.
Okay, thank you.
But Achilles, do you understand the question that the suggestion that Matthew has? Since this is actually simulated data, we know all the parameters. If you go and plug in, you can get the value of the loss function, right?
Yeah.
So you will see that loss function is lower, the same, or above what you actually have for the different cases. That's an easy test to do.
Yeah, I think when we ran it with all the data given, it would calculate the parameters exactly.
Oh, I see. So that's equivalent. Okay. Yeah. So it's low. Okay.
Any more questions for the speaker?
What's the next step, Achilles, now? So you have identified actually for the sickle cell anemia, you have identified all these factors which are sort of synergistic, right, into having a higher rate of phagocytosis. Is it as simple as just change the values of this and let's say with some parameters that you have identified, run forward and predict the total effect of eat-me signal?
Currently, no, because we need to be able to assimilate the different results, the different parameters, so that it forms a more accurate representation of the phagocytosis rates in sickle cell disease. Because as seen in the curves, some of the phagocytosis rates are increased to about 100%, even with a variation of one parameter or one initial condition. But we need to compound all of the different changes for the sickle cell. So we would need to find a configuration where the phagocytosis rate is representative of an actual patient with sickle cell disease. Because if we just include all of the changes right now, it would likely just have a 100% phagocytosis rate, and it would not be representative of the patient's actual system.
Yeah. Also, I have another question. How do we deal with the fact that in a sickle cell patient, you don't actually, not all cells are sickled. In fact, these people have transfusions. So in the beginning of the transfusion, there are basically very few sickle cells. And then in about a month and a half, they have like 40% or more than, actually, I think there's 60% of their cells are at least sickled. So how do you account for the fact that you have this mixed population of red blood cells, right? Which you have to have a factor to say, well, from how do you do that in the ODEs? I cannot see it.
This could be adjusted by adding like a parameter that increases with time that is basically a proportion of the sickle cells or the healthy red blood cells. And this could be added onto the equations where there is a variance of the parameters.
I have one more question. Or is there a way, right? The loss function is trying to minimize mean squared error, but you know that in the noisy case, even the true parameters would have some error because of the noise.
Yeah.
And so, you have a lot of these parameters, some are not even identifiable. You might be sort of overfitting the noise in some sense. Do you think there would be a way to add something to the loss function that basically encouraged you to have some noise, almost like a regularizer, in the sense that you actually don't want to get mean squared error to 0, because then you would know that you would be fitting the noise. You want to get it down to whatever sort of sigma you're using. I wonder if something like that would help.
Yeah, I haven't looked into that, and I'm not too familiar with that, to be honest. But I think that we should also start to include the standard deviation into the comparison, so we can make a more accurate determination of the identifiability, because the noise was added based on a 5% standard deviation for each of the ODs. I don't think there's a regularizer in the function though, but we should look into that.
I think Jen, I think you have used the regularizer, right? For the
but like I don't think like for this problem there is a severe overfitting issue, because Achilles, you may want to like go back to the page where you show like the results when you have like the reverse problem. Could you show that, like noisy reverse problem?
I think I have that in a hidden slide, so let me see how I can show that in a second.
Like 5% error and the noise like reverse.
Yeah, just 1 second. So this is the 100 seconds case with the noise. So I think there is some overfitting here to follow the noise, but
yeah, it's like so I think it's like I'm not sure if this is like very strong overfitting like on the data, but yeah, we can definitely try like adding some regularization term to see if the results can be any better. But like one of the issue, if we can see from this figure, is that the X3 is not matching the ground truth very well, while X3 is not given as data. So it's like we can fit the data in a reasonable way, but when there is no data, the ODE model is not recovering the correct thing. And when we check the ODE models, we find that this is possibly because of the different, like the scale of the problem is different, so that in the ODE, there are some terms which is larger, some terms which is smaller, so that it makes some parameters which is very hard to learn. And this in turn like gives the, like when we cannot correctly identify some of the parameters because of the scale doesn't like, the scale differs in the ODEs. So it cannot recover the crack dynamics for certain state variables. I think that may be the major issue here.
Jen, I was wondering if you guys consider having, let's say, data on X3, which seems to be the most resistant species.
Yeah, we'll try that. Yeah.
And did you try that? And then the identifiability issue is easier.
Yes. Like at least for when the error is small, like when the noise is small, all the parameters we are learning becomes identifiable.
But then you add a noise and you know X3, you still have these discrepancies.
Oh, no. There will not be such discrepancies. When we know X3, it just matches the data.
What is X3? Can we see the equation for X3?
Yeah.
Why is it so special?
I think X3 is has a difficulty in being estimated because all of the parameters in this are globally identifiable, so none of them are given as data. So maybe it could be skewing the calculation of the parameters for this case.
So basically, X3 should be obtained from the second equation, like because we have X1 as data, and from X1 we get X2. Because we see from the plot that X2 actually matches the data pretty well, so we can see like X2 is somewhat also given, but like we need to use the equation 2 to get X3. But this equation has some problem in the sense that the first term, which is K7, X1, X15, which is very large, but the rest of the term in terms of scale are very small. So like this makes the training a little bit difficult for like both identifying the parameters and like correctly recovering the X3.
Right.
Hi, this is Anirudh here. I had one question. I feel, did you try splitting the time interval into smaller time interval and try to do the like in a sequential format that maybe that might help to have a little bit better estimation?
I did not try that. All that we did was do it into a 100-second case and a 180-second case. But are you suggesting to break it into different time intervals?
Yeah, into smaller interval, and the result that you get in the end of one time interval and use it as the initial condition for the next.
Yeah, we haven't done that, but we can look into it.
Achilles, we actually yesterday, Ameya, are you there? Because yeah, we discussed this for stiff systems of ODEs.
Yes.
Ameya, you're here, right?
Yes.
So maybe you can talk about the XPIN, how we think we can solve this stiffer ODE problems, which appears in chemical kinetics a lot. And so we have actually a new project with the company to look into it. But can you say something about XPIN and how, just following up also on the previous question?
Yeah. So actually, here we can employ the domain decomposition in time, and we can actually that's the whole idea of XPIN here. And actually, we can use a powerful network. I mean, based on the. I mean, of course, we can do it adaptively, and that's what the idea is, which we are already working on that. Or else we can do it manually if we know the how to decompose the domains and use the locally powerful neural networks. So for example, if there is a gradient or a stiff for a stiff parameter, then we can use a powerful network there to that was the basic idea.
So you break up, Achilles, what the XPIN stands for, extended pin, is you break up the domain into subdomains, the time domain, right there, the time axis. And then according to the gradients, you select subdomains. In each subdomain, you have a different pin. Now, if you have oscillations, then you can use a one activation function and a different neural network. If you have, let's say, very sharp rise, right, steep gradients, then you can use a hyperbolic tangent for activation function. So you can basically match the dynamics with the neural network architecture for that domain. And then what you do, the residuals in your loss functions, we know how they have to be zero, right? So they have to be continuous, therefore. So you impose continuity of the residuals from one time domain to the other. So this is a method that Ameya developed, XPIN. And it so happens now that we, yesterday we had a meeting with a company that they just won have a joint STTR to actually look into, but that's for chemical kinetics and explosions and so on, but not actually dissimilar. Yeah. Thank you, Achilles. Samdata, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you, Achilles. Now we'll welcome our second speaker. So Charles Parker, who's our second speaker, he is basically a fifth-year PhD student working with Mark Einworth on high-order finite element methods, particularly methods with extra smoothness. Today, he would be giving us a talk on the topic titled high-order conforming finite element methods with extra smoothness. So yeah, you can start, Charles. Thank you.
All right, hello, you can hear me clearly still, right?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I have a more traditional talk today, nothing dealing with neural networks or anything like that. So yeah, we're just going to take a look at essentially two examples of high order finite element methods with extra smoothness. The first will be H2 conforming finite element methods, where we'll mostly talk about like two model problems to simply support a Kirchhoff plate and incompressible flow. And then the second part of the talk will do uniformly stable mass conserving elements for Stokes equations. Okay, so for the first part, we're going to do H2 conforming finite element methods. So let's just take a look at the difference between like H1 and H2 problems. So for H1 problems, we have the Poisson equation, which everybody knows, with the weak form written here. And so, you know, if we go to an H2 problem that's kind of analogous, it's called the biharmonic equation when f is 0. And so the differences here are highlighted in red. So now we have Laplacian squared instead of Laplacian. We have a second boundary condition of Laplacian u is equal to 0. And the weak form, now we require H2, we require u to be in H2 as well as the test function. And instead of having gradients, we have Laplacians on the functions. And so the biharmonic equation arises in the theory of Kirchhoff plates and the stream function formulation of the 2D Stokes equations. So we'll come back to both these examples later. There's some other H2 problems like the Cahn-Hilliard equation. So if you follow all of these divergences and gradients through, you see 4 derivatives hit u. There's also this generalized Perona-Malik equation for noise reduction in images. And again, if you follow the divergence and gradients through, it's 4 derivatives hitting u. And there's more examples from like extended AMHD equations, flame propagation, viscous film flow, ice sheet modeling, etc. So how do people actually discretize these fourth order problems? So the first is the conforming Galerkin method, where you just seek UHP in some conforming finite element space that's a subset of like H2, H10. And I forgot the HP is the subscript of this U, but it's basically the same as the original problem. The downsides are this requires C1 continuity of the elements, which are more complicated than the usual C0 elements for H1 problems. This increased complexity means they're harder to code, and it's not very popular in the literature. Another way is to do a mixed finite element approximation. So here we basically introduce an auxiliary quantity phi HP, which is like an approximation to the Laplacian. But now we end up with a system of equations. But importantly, the finite element space now is just a subset of H10. So we can use the usual conforming finite elements that we're all used to. And so there's a lot of literature on these methods. You know, we only have C0 continuity in this case. Mixed methods can help with problems involving locking. However, you double the number of unknowns and you get an indefinite linear system. And it can also be hard to maintain certain conservation properties of the original equation. It's not so obvious from this example here, but when you can pick these two subspaces separately, if you don't pick them correctly, you can lose things like mass conservation, as we'll see with the Stokes equations later. Okay, so the other ways like DG methods and non-conforming Galerkin methods. So this includes the more recent C0 interior penalty methods. Again, there's a lot of literature. They're pretty easy to implement. They can also offer advantages for problems involving locking. However, they require choosing parameters to ensure stability and accuracy. And so I, in general, want to avoid parameters being in the method. because when you go to couple different methods together, for example, if you're coupling Cahn-Hilliard equation with Navier-Stokes flow, you don't want to be choosing parameters for each method because they could affect one another, and you have to be very careful how you choose them.
Carly, I just want to say that one of the students of Professor Xu has done a PhD thesis on DG for very high order, like fourth order PDEs. I don't know if you are familiar with that work. It was probably more than 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago.
Do you remember their name?
No, you have to. We have to
Okay.
check with Xu, but basically we're looking at the same problem, just looking at DG and how they would go around that. And of course they have theory, so the parameters are not like, you know, arbitrary like you imply.
Yeah. So I guess I more mean like these C0 interior penalty methods, because at a few conferences, they ask, okay, well, we'll eventually get there, but they ask, how does the method that I'm proposing compare with these sort of methods? Whoops. And, you know, however, they go to remark that actually choosing the penalty parameter specifically for the C0 interior penalty method can actually be very complicated. And they have to play around with it a lot in order to get one that works. So that's more of what I mean. But yeah.
You know, it's true, but that's why, because if you look at your references, and you know, this has been like 20 years back, right? So I'm just saying that there's more recent references from our school, from our department, where the people have looked at this. I've looked at not the way you will approach it, but I'm just saying that it's very relevant. That this is very relevant to what you're doing. You may want to check it out.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to use the pth order conforming H2 conforming R-gyrus elements. So let's take a look at what they actually are. Okay. So this is like an illustration of the degrees of freedom. So at each vertex, you have 6 degrees of freedom. So the dot corresponds to functional evaluation. Then the first circle corresponds to the gradient, and the second circle corresponds to the Hessian. Along each edge, you can have 2 types of degrees of freedom. One is like functional values at the edge, and the other is function or evaluation of the normal derivative along the edge, which is represented by the arrow. And then you can have interior degrees of freedom, which can be functional evaluations or anything associated to the interior of the triangle. Okay, so let's just take a look at some numerical examples of using these elements. So the first is the simply supported Kirchhoff plate. So the bilinear form is a little more complicated than just the Laplacian, but that doesn't really matter. It involves second derivatives, so it's still an H2 problem. And here we're applying a point load at this red circle, which does correspond to a vertex in the mesh. The rest of the parameters don't really matter. So you see the solution on the right. And so, we get a nice smooth solution of the displacements. So here you're poking the plate from below. So this is a very thin plate and you're poking it at this dot from below. So the displacements are all positive near the poke. And what's important here, we can actually use a delta function right-hand side because we're in H2. So if you're doing a mixed method, you'd have to regularize the right-hand side in order for it to be well defined. Okay, so the main quantity of interest is the von Mises stress. Which is it's some combination of the stresses which are related to the second derivatives of U. And so here we have a log plot where I just incremented by 1, so that way the log plot is bounded away from -infinity. But the point here is that even though that there's no continuity imposed on the second derivatives of U, you still get a pretty smooth profile of the stresses. So I will just admit this is, the values of the second derivatives are discontinuous, and this is just interpolated to a grid for plotting purposes. But the main thing with high order is that, if we zoom in on this corner, there's a singularity here in the stresses, but it's isolated to just the elements that directly touch the corner, as you can see with the oscillations in the stress here. And it actually blows up at the corner. Whereas if we zoom in on where the point load is, everything is nice and smooth. Okay, so the second example is Moffat eddies in a wedge. So here we're doing the Stokes equation in this wedge. So here is the biharmonic equation. We're imposing a parabolic velocity profile on the top. And the main quantity interest is the rotated gradient, which is the velocity U. So on the right is the p equal to 5 solution on this very simple mesh of only 16 elements. So here each eddy is about 300 times weaker than the previous one. So you see the p equal 5 solution resolves one eddy, and that's basically it. These eddies are not well resolved. So if we go up to the p equal 14 solution, then we see that actually we get you see 3 eddies fine in the first picture, and then if we just zoom in on the numerical solution, we see an additional 2 eddies. So these 2 eddies exist just in the bottom, just in one element alone. And so, you see here that essentially we're resolving around like 10 to the 13 range of scales here. So this first eddy is 10 to the 13 larger than this last eddy that we see here. And so, it's very challenging to get this sort of resolution with any sort of low order method. You would need quite the number of elements, whereas I'm just using 16 elements here on this triangle. Okay, so the key idea behind these Argyris elements is that it's only the boundary degrees of freedom that ensure this C1 continuity of cross elements. And so, this has a nice sort of correspondence with Bernstein polynomials. So Bernstein polynomials are proportional to like all the barycentric coordinates multiplied together with the exponents summing to p. And so they can be associated with a point in the triangle, which is the maximum of this function. But so you can see, for example, like with these vertices here, there's 6 degrees of freedom associated with this bottom left vertex. And there's also 6 Bernstein polynomials that are associated with the second derivatives at this vertex. And the same is true for the normal derivatives along the edge and edge functional values. So you have 3 degrees of freedom for the Argyris element on the left, and then you also have 3 degrees of freedom associated with the edge and normal derivatives for the Bernstein polynomial. And so because we have this sort of one-to-one correspondence, one might ask, why can you relate the two in terms of implementation? Because the Bernstein polynomials by themselves are only continuous across elements. They are not C1. And so the answer is yes, and this is exactly how we implement them. So we first just compute the element stiffness matrix and load vector using Bernstein polynomials, and we can do this optimally using algorithms that my advisor developed. And then you can just compute this, essentially change of basis. So you can map the Bernstein degrees of freedom to the Argyris degrees of freedom, but you only need to do this on the boundary. Because if we go back, you see they share the same number of interior, quote unquote, interior degrees of freedom. And so we don't need to use point-wise evaluation on the triangle here as indicated on the left. We can just use the Bernstein degree of freedoms for the interiors. Okay, so the other important thing to note is that this matrix Z has a very simple structure, and it's very easy to compute just using simple Bernstein formulas. So then if you want to have the stiffness matrix for this Argyris basis, then you can just compute the change of basis for the stiffness matrix and load vector. And what's important here is, because we're using the interior degrees of freedom associated to the Bernsteins, that's most of the degrees of freedom on the triangle. So inverting this matrix Z can be done in order p cubed time. And then going through this whole process, we never actually directly compute with the Argyris basis functions. So we don't need explicit formulas for them. And this is a big advantage because most implementations require some sort of explicit formula for the basis functions. And we can easily extend this implementation idea to 3D or into any HK conforming space. There's nothing special about it being H2 conforming or being in 2D.
I have a question about step 2. So that is done numerically?
Yes. Yeah. This is
so you have to do
done
that for every element, right? Or for every family of elements?
Right. So this is done on every single physical element. As is you can do the first step on every element or every physical element on a reference element and map it, but the second step is done on every physical element.
Does that add cost?
There's more than one way to think about it. So if you assume that you have some variable coefficient problem.
I know. I mean, for the more difficult cases, not the stationary.
So computing the stiffness matrix takes order p to the 4th, whereas computing this matrix Z just takes order p cubed.
Okay.
So for high p node, this doesn't really add any additional, no cost, at least in the complexity.
But I may have 1 million elements, right?
Yeah, but if you have 1 million elements and you have variable coefficients, you're going to have to compute the stiffness matrix on every element as well. So the cost is dominated by computing the stiffness matrix, not by computing the transformation.
Okay. Thank you.
And if you're doing it in matrix-free way, it would be of the same order of. So you can compute the stiffness matrix in a matrix-free way that would be order p cubed, but computing the matrix Z and inverting it would be of the same order. Right. And yeah, I mean, the other thing is like this, so computing the stiffness matrix can be done in optimal complexity, and I'm not aware of any H2 conforming method that can be, for which you can even compute the stiffness matrix in optimal complexity either. So, okay, so although the results I showed you look great, the problem is preconditioning. So if we look at the condition numbers, just for fixed meshes as we increase P, so on a single element with no essential boundary conditions, it grows exponentially fast, as is the case for both the Moffat eddies and for the Kirchhoff plate, where these condition numbers are now untenable for inverting linear system. So the idea is that we're just going to modify the basis functions so that we can get a preconditioner just from zeroing out elements of the global stiffness matrix. So we'll group these basis functions by type. The first is the C1 vertex functions. So where by this, I mean, they interpolate the functional values at vertices and the values of the gradients at vertices. And the only assumptions here is that they're of a fixed degree and that they can reproduce affine functions. The second part, so the second group is the C2 vertex functions, and they interpolate the second derivatives at vertices. And so here we assume some, what looks like a strange condition, that the H2 semi-norm decays like P to the -2. And so it's not so obvious that such functions exist, but we'll get to that in a second. And then for the edge functions and the interior functions, we'll just use we won't change those at all from before. But it's important to remark that the edge functions can actually do whatever you like, as can the interior functions, but that will just modify the change of basis. And so, you need an extra step to handle this additional change of basis, but this is also easy and doesn't add to the overall complexity of the original change of basis. Okay, so in matrix form, then all we need to do is so we first do static condensation of the interior degrees of freedom, as in take the Schur complement system with respect to the interior degrees of freedom. And then we're just going to zero out certain subblocks of the resulting matrix. So we have to keep all of the C1 vertex functions coupled together, all of the C2 vertex functions completely decouple, and all of the edge degrees of freedom only stay coupled together with the degrees of freedom on that edge. They decouple from all of their edges. And so the point here is that this matrix is not too expensive to invert. So yes, if you have a million elements, this will then inverting this S block, will become expensive to invert. But then we can either develop or you can use existing preconditioners for the H version finite element method on this block. So the result is that the condition number of the preconditioning system using this preconditioner grows at most like 1 plus log cubed P. And so if we look at like the Moffat-Eddy problem, the Kirchhoff plate problem, the blue line is the condition numbers of the actual system, and the orange line is something proportional to 1 plus log cubed P. And so it agrees pretty well. And the condition numbers are, relatively tame. So they were on the order of 10 to the 12, 13 before, now they're on the order of a few hundred. And then similarly, if we look at like the iteration counts, then the iteration counts grow modestly in P, but not too fast. Right, so some theoretical aspects which I won't go too much into, but there's basically two important components. So the first is there's these special 1D polynomials that decay very rapidly. So essentially this function f interpolates the second derivative at the left endpoint. So all of its other derivatives of order less than 2 vanish at both endpoints, and its second derivative is 0 at the right endpoint. And g is the same thing, but for the first derivative. And so these functions decay their L2 norms decay very fast in P. So f decays like P to the -5 in L2, and g decays like P to the -3. And so just a quick remark is that you can construct these functions for an arbitrary number of derivatives that you want to interpolate, and the decay will behave in the same fashion. So the second component is an H2 stable polynomial extension theorem. So what this says is that if you give me two functions f and g, such that f is piecewise degree p on the boundary of the triangle and g is piecewise degree p -1, and these functions satisfy certain compatibility conditions at the vertices, then you can find a polynomial defined over the whole triangle such that its restriction to the boundary is f, its normal derivative on the boundary is g, and most importantly, its H2 norm is bounded by an appropriate boundary norm on the data. So this boundary norm can be interpreted as, I mean, F is just U on the boundary, and the second term here is just the gradient of U on the boundary. So this is what, if the boundary was smooth, you would expect higher order subbelow norms, but the boundary is not smooth, so this is what you get. And so if we sort of combine these 1D polynomials on each edge of the triangle with this H2 extension theorem, then you can construct the C2 basis functions that decay at the right rate. And what's sort of interesting that we didn't know at the time is that both of these results will actually be used later in proofs for the elements for Stokes flow. So just a quick summary of the H2 stuff is that, you know, C1 elements are not difficult to implement contrary to popular belief, and that P refinement with C1 elements gives good resolution to problems with multi-scale features, and that, you know, although conditioning is a significant obstacle, we solved it in a practical manner. So, you know, natural future directions are, well, can we construct a uniform P preconditioner? So the preconditioner right now is non-overlapping, and that's in some sense the best you can get with non-overlapping. And so if you now allow for overlapping preconditioners, then we can probably get something that's uniform in P. And then the obvious step is also, can you do this in 3D, where basically every inequality used in the proof no longer holds in a well, or at least in a reasonable way anymore. Right, so I can pause for a second to take questions on the first half before I go to the second half, since they're pretty disjoint. Or I can just go straight into the second half.
Charlie, I have a question here, because you clearly it's a good method, and the precondition seems to, and you have a theoretical estimate, but how can you convince me to use this instead of breaking up the Cahn-Hilliard into a system, so that I solve a system for using my C0 elements versus this? Yeah, I mean, I have to have a compelling argument to actually adopt this higher. I mean, I'm just thinking, like, historically, there has been a reason why even higher order systems, higher order differential operators are treated with C0 elements, right? Because you always want to write as a first order, second order systems, and use the existing technology, because that's all the mesh generations and everything. But I mean, what would be the point here to tell me? Because the high accuracy, I can have high accuracy with spectral elements and C0 for the, in fact, the, you know, the Stokes problem that you show, right? The cavity, that's from my book, where I show the 4 eddies and so on. That's, you know, I introduced that to fluid mechanics, and it's a very good problem, because of course the vortex, the strength of the vortex decays by, like you said, 300, 400, depends on the angle. So that's fine, but how do you convince me to use this method? What's the selling point?
Well, I mean, so when you break Cahn-Hilliard into a system, you now have, I mean, you've doubled the number, you have doubled the number of unknowns when you don't need to. Yes. And depending on what time stepping you're using or whatever, you have to solve a saddle point problem instead of a positive definite problem.
Correct. So you think that overall the cost, you will give me a factor of 2 or more, for example, right? Improvement.
Well, I mean, it will probably even more, because it's probably a factor of 4 or more. But I mean, so yeah, I mean, the main, yeah, I mean, it's mostly that, right? I don't need twice the number of unknowns, unless, like, because in Cahn-Hilliard, right, you're just introducing an auxiliary quantity which you don't necessarily need. Whereas for Stokes, it makes more, I mean, well, that's the second half of the talk, but it makes more sense because you might want the pressure at the same time.
And you have the same argument also for DG, that DG will increase the number of right. second order operators, for high order even more, right? That's sort of your argument.
Yeah, and I mean, I know you said there's work on the parameter picking and stuff like that, but it's also like, well, if I couple Cahn-Hilliard with Navier-Stokes and they're both using methods that need parameters, they might, I mean, it's not obvious, it's probably not obvious how to choose the parameters in relation to one another either. So if you can avoid parameters, you should avoid parameters, like for stability purposes only.
Okay, all right, thank you.
that's, I mean, I can also give you Mark's response of, if you can use conforming, why wouldn't you use conforming? But I don't think that's as helpful.
No, no. You need sometimes for refinement, when you have patches of refinement, which could be the costly part, you need to use non-conforming. So that's not a, yeah.
Yeah, the other issue with this is, right, I've just talked about straight edge triangles, where it's not so clear how you do this if the boundary is curved. And in fact, you will likely be non-conforming when the boundary is curved. And there's been some work on, you should just add another term into the bilinear form, because when you do this sort of thing, because you have derivative degrees of freedom, but if you have a curved boundary, then it's not obvious how to construct a basis that actually vanishes in the boundary and its normal derivative vanishes on the boundary.
Right.
But anyway, those are like exception. I mean, that's strictly on the boundary, but then the rest of the interior is fine.
I see this
Yeah.
method as use it inside in the domain for refinement. So the triangle will be straight. That's not the issue. The issue is maybe more in 3D. How you make
Yes.
this work.
Yeah. Like I said, the implementation idea works, but we have not done any work yet in 3D.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So for the second half, I want to talk about uniformly stable mass conserving elements for the Stokes equations, also still in 2D. So we have the 2D Stokes equations where the main quantities of interest are the velocity u and the pressure p, and you have a divergence u equals 0 condition. For simplicity, I'm going to assume a u is 0 on the boundary for now. And so you get the associated weak form, which is in this mixed finite element or saddle point problem case, where the bilinear form A is just the grad bilinear form. It can also be the symmetric gradient one that makes no difference. Well, it's equivalent in this case, but if you had other boundary conditions, it makes no difference. But the second bilinear form is divergence of E against P. And so if we just do a conforming high order discretization, we just replace U and P with UHK, PHK. So now I'm using K to denote polynomial order instead of P, since P is the pressure. Right, so then, right, so we're picking conforming spaces, and the key ingredient to a stable discretization is the M sub condition. So if you're not familiar with this, it's fine. So we don't need to dwell on it too much, but it essentially says that the divergence operator is invertible, and the continuity, or in the norm of the inverse is bounded. Okay, so there's a lot of existing high order elements for this problem already. So on quadrilaterals, for example, you could use like QK, PK -1, continuous discontinuous elements, which satisfy uniform slip condition, or you can modify you can use like this QK prime space or this trunk space, which is continuous, and that also has a uniform slip condition. Or you can go to, I mean, there are others on quadrilaterals, but I'm mostly focused on triangles. I just picked the two stable ones, or uniformly stable ones. So on triangles, there's PK -2, which people use. So that in-slip condition is only proven to decay like K to the -3. There's the Scott-Vogelius elements, which I denote PK -1, even though that's not exactly what they are. So if you look at their proofs and follow all the dependence on the polynomial order, it's like K to the -7 epsilon. There's Taylor-Hood, which is PK -1 continuous. So again, that's been proven to also decay in polynomial order. And same with, there's also a spectral element that's kind of similar to QK -2, which also decays. But if you relax the continuity to H div, then it was shown that the PK -1 elements are uniformly stable. Okay, so what is the motivation for developing the elements I'm going to introduce? So you have this sort of exact sequence at the continuous level, which means that, yeah, so what does the sequence mean? So 0 is an H20. The curl of an H20 function is in H10, and the div of an H10 function is in L20. Where curl here is just rotating gradient because we're in 2D. And so the sequence is exact in the sense that if you compose any two operators, you get 0. So the divergence of a curl is 0. And if you have a velocity v in H10 whose divergence is 0, then it's the curl of an H2 function. So what this means in terms of the original problem is that if you, the second equation, which is BUQ equals 0, for all Q and L2, that implies the divergence of U is 0 almost everywhere. And that U is also the curl of some function in H2 0. So if you can find some third finite element space so that the spaces you choose also satisfy an exact sequence property, then your numerical solution will also be pointwise divergence free, at least up to machine precision. And it'll be the curl of some function in this H2 finite element space. Okay, so what do we actually choose? So we're going to choose the sigma to be the modified tuba or gyre space. So these elements are a little strange, so I'll just go through them more slowly. So it's, okay, so sigma is piecewise polynomials of degree k plus 1, such that there are C2 at non-corner vertices. The velocity space will be just C1 at non-corner vertices, but otherwise just continuous, and Q will be discontinuous except it's continuous at non-corner vertices, where non-corner vertices here mean of the mesh itself. And so the local degrees of freedom of the sigma space are exactly the same as the first part of the talk. And then then you basically just remove a circle and remove the arrows to get the local degrees of freedom for the velocity. So you have gradient degrees of freedom at the vertices. And for the pressure, you just have degrees of freedom at the vertices that are shared, but all the other degrees of freedom are in the interior of the triangle. Okay, so we need a special condition on the mesh, which looks sort of weird at first. So it's basically a mesh is corner split if it contains no quote unquote singular vertices, where the only singular vertices are illustrated by these two pictures. So it's an element that has two boundary edges, two edges on the boundary of the domain. So that's one type of singular vertex. And the other is you have exactly 3 elements around a re-entrant corner, and all of the edges meeting at the vertex lie on exactly 2 lines. So as in exactly as it's pictured. And so we basically have to disallow these 2 configurations. And if you're concerned that this is sort of weird, it is a slightly weird condition, but it's easy to get around this just by doing, say, for example, on the left, you just do a barycentric refinement on this one element. And on the right, you can do a barycentric refinement on any of the elements or all of the elements, it doesn't matter. And the point is that this sequence now of finite element spaces is exact if and only if the mesh is corner split, which is great. So then Falk and Nealon have already shown that these spaces satisfy the following properties: that the divergence of V is Q, and that they're uniformly insubstable in H. So we've also shown that they're uniformly insubstable with respect to the polynomial degree, which just means basically the following relation holding. So there's some universal constant beta 0, which will depend on shape regularity of the mesh, but that's it. Independent of H and K, such that essentially this is just the sub condition again. So, but here we have this weird factor of this theta of TH, which measures how close the mesh is to not being corner split. But again, it's easy to ensure that this thing is uniformly bounded below. So in essence, you have uniform substability. And so if we just look at the sub constants, for example, like when a reference element.
Is it quantifiable? I can understand the split condition, but now how close I am to corner split or so on, what does that mean now?
Yeah, I didn't write down the precise definition here. So this only applies in this re-entrant corner case, because you cannot be, if you're shape regular, you cannot be close to this configuration. That's just not, so you have to, because it means you have 2 elements here, but neither of them can be too close to being degenerate because you're shape regular. So it only applies to this configuration. And so what the condition means is that you need at least one, so there's 3 angles here, right? But in the 3 elements. So you need the sum of, so you either need that theta 0 plus theta 1 is far away from pi, or theta 1 plus theta 2 is far away from pi.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so there is a precise quantification, but I just did not write it down. But if you have 4 elements here instead, you don't need to check anything. Just like here, you don't need to check it in this case on the left. So if you have 4 elements instead of 3, you also don't need to check the condition. That's why it's a little weird, but it's also shouldn't be taken to be prohibitive. Right, so if we look at the actual values of the sub constants, then we've proven they're uniformly away from 0, but you see that they're around 1/4 on like one, or on the reference element, and they're even higher on an actual mesh. And as you refine the mesh, they really don't change after one refinement. So yeah, the additional properties you get, which I've already said, is, the solution is pointwise divergence free. We've also shown that these spaces possess optimal approximation properties. So for example, you have the standard HS -1 estimate here in terms of the mesh size and the polynomial degree. We can also show that like on geometrically graded meshes with certain regularity conditions that the finite element solution will converge exponentially fast to the true solution. But I'm not going to quantify that here. But the main thing to note from this sort of error estimate is that the velocity error is independent of the pressure error. So if you have some large pressure gradient in the true solution, it will not show up in the error in the velocity. It will only show up in the error of the pressure, which is something that's not true if you don't have this pointwise divergence free property. All right, so let's go back to the Moffat example with a slightly different mesh now, because we have this corner split condition. So you probably don't remember, but before this was just one element down here, now it's two, and the geometry is slightly different, but it's more or less the same. And then, there's really no small elements down here. I'm not lying to you, it really just has two elements. So let's just look at the degree 13 solution. So before we looked at the degree 14 solution when we were using the bioharmonic equation with the C2 or with the C1 elements. So if the gradient's degree 13, so this is essentially the corresponding solution, but when you do it with the mixed problem. So you see the velocity looks well, or looks nice. This is now a logarithmic color plot in the background, and the pressure also looks nice. There's no continuity imposed in the pressure between elements, but you can see here, even though there's a singularity in the pressure, that the jump between elements is pretty small, at least relative to the overall magnitude of the pressure. So if we zoom in on the red box I showed before, you resolve essentially the same number of eddies as before. Now it's more obvious that the range of scale, these bottom eddies are here on the order of like 10 to the minus 12. And the pressure is also self-similar. So it's interesting that you still see this sort of, it's at a much smaller magnitude now, but the same sort of profile of the pressure. We're also going to do this T-shaped cavity. So there's going to be an imposed parabolic velocity profile on the left and right ends of the cavity. But now we're going to use these geometrically graded meshes. So this is with like one layer of elements near the corners. Whereas if we zoom in with 3 layers of elements, we see the topology all looks the same. It's just zoomed in to see where this sort of gets us. So if we look at the error plots, so the left is a log-log plot. So you expect it to sort of curve downwards. So the envelope of these curves should curve downwards. And each of these lines correspond to the same layers of elements, but increasing the polynomial degree. So like the blue line, we start with degree 4 and increase, and then we refine the mesh to get the orange line and then also increase the ordered elements. And on the right is the same thing, but now it's a semi-log plot instead of a log-log plot. And we see that the envelope of the curves is a line. So what's going on here with this 4 layers, this last part doesn't look as good, but that's likely just due to round off error. I know these errors are not very small, but at that point you're using pretty small elements because I'm doing an 8% grading. So what can you really hope for there? Yeah.
Does the error come in from the 270? Because you have 2 angles of 270 degrees, right?
Yeah, so the blow up, we're gonna look at it. We're gonna look at the solution in a second, but the blow up is cut. The error is coming from these 2 reentrant corners.
Yeah.
Right. So if we just look at zoom in on the reentrant corner, look at what do you get, at least visually speaking, as you refine the number of elements near there and increase the polynomial degree. So you see that you both capture the shock, or not shock, but the discontinuity much better, and also the neighboring elements are also, they're nearly continuous across the element, even though they're only continuous at the vertices. Yeah, and this is sort of where it's important that you have this sort of corner split property, because if you did not have that, then the pressure would force, or the pressure would be forced to satisfy some sort of constraint at this vertex, where you don't want any sort of constraints at this vertex so that it can resolve this discontinuity. Yeah, so if we just look at the numerical solution of the pressure overall, I mean, you see that these are indeed very, very sharp gradients here at the re-entrant corners. And so we're going to zoom in on the numerical solution here with degree 10 elements with 4 layers of refinement. Yeah, and the degree is uniform across all of the elements, just for simplicity. All right, so if we zoom in on so we're going to zoom in on this bottom right-hand corner where there's again this sort of Moffett-Eddy phenomenon, just to see how well we can resolve it. I mean, we are using like many layers of elements here, so we should be able to resolve everything. So if we zoom in, we see it's the same. Zoom in again, it's the same. So now we zoom in and overlay the mesh. So again, it's the same. And on the final zoom in, where we're just in 2 elements, we see now like the true solution's on the order of 10 to the minus 17. So we've resolved everything we can in terms of machine precision. Which is what you would want from the method. Right, so now it's how do you actually implement this method? The space is a little weird. You have continuity in the pressure at vertices, which is not usually what you see. And so basically we just partition the pressure basis functions as follows. So you first have a basis for pk minus 1 of polynomials that are average 0. So you get interior functions and vertex functions, which sort of look like these 2 functions down here at the bottom. And then you need one more function for whole basis for pk minus 1 on the reference element. So you just take 1 minus the vertex functions. So for the velocity basis functions, it gets to be a little more complicated. So you have the C0 vertex functions, which interpolate the functional values, but they have vanishing gradients. You have the C1 vertex functions, which interpolate the gradients. And here we're assuming the proportion with some special Jacobi polynomial, which I'll comment more on in a second. But this is sort of the analog of the C2 basis functions in the H2 problems. And then the edge functions, interior functions can essentially be whatever you want. The edge functions just have to vanish. Their gradients have to vanish at the endpoints as well. Okay, so how do we develop a preconditioner for this to be used with MinRes? So we first partition to essentially like interior and quote unquote exterior degrees of freedom, where the exterior ones are associated with the boundaries of the triangles. Although this is slightly different for the pressure, because in these pressure exterior functions, you have to include the average value function. But anyway, then you perform static condensation. So more explicitly than what I said before is that you are just taking the short complement here. And so we want a block diagonal preconditioner to be used with MinRes. And so it's easiest to maybe write it out like this instead of in matrix form. So again,
don't you have, and this matrix is symmetric?
Are you asking, what's your question?
My question is, the matrices are not symmetric?
These, which matrices?
All the stiffness matrices, all these matrices.
So the entire stiffness matrix is symmetric. This top left block is symmetric. This bottom right block is symmetric, but the top right block is the transpose of the bottom left block.
Right. So it's not. I was thinking, why don't you use conjugate gradients? But because of you break the symmetry somehow.
No, it's symmetric, but it has there's negative eigenvalues. It's not
okay. Okay. Yeah. So it's not positive definite. That's the okay.
Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah, you have one negative eigenvalue for at least every constant pressure mode on each triangle. So there's quite a number of negative eigenvalues.
I see. Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay, so I should guess comment first. There's many ways to solve this sort of problem. We're just going with an iterative solver on the entire system. You can break it up and use some other method, but we're just going to solve this whole system at once. Okay, so the preconditioner is sort of similar to the H2 one on each component. So for the velocity function, we're just keeping together the C0 vertex functions. Then the C1 vertex functions decouple entirely for every vertex and for every derivative degree of freedom. The edges are coupled together, but decoupled from every other edge. And then all of the pressure degrees of freedom entirely decouple in an entirely matrix-free way. So yeah, I mean, this is basically a uniform approximation to the pressure mass matrix, but we never have to compute the pressure mass matrix. Right, so that's basically the preconditioner. And so we can prove again that the quote unquote effective condition number grows at most like 1 plus log cubed p. So what does this mean? It means that the largest positive eigenvalue grows less than 1 plus log cubed p. So that is this blue line here. This is just the eigenvalue plotted by itself. So it's bounded independently of p, at least it seems like that numerically. It also means that the largest negative eigenvalue, as in largest in absolute value, is also bounded by 1 plus log cubed p. But if we look at this graph here, it seems to be bounded independently of that as well. And then that the smallest positive eigenvalue decays like log to the minus 3k. So if you normalize it right, yeah, we see it's bounded right. And then the smallest negative eigenvalue is also appears to be bounded independently of p. So this is for the Moffett problem. And the number of iterations in MinRes is on the right. So again, it'll grow modestly in the polynomial degree. Oh, sorry, that should be log cubed k, not p here. But, right, so yeah, these sort of bounds on the eigenvalues of the preconditioned system give you a bound for the MinRes iterations and the residual, but it's a little messier for indefinite systems. In fact, it's roughly every 2 iterations you're supposed to get a reduction in the residual as opposed to every iteration with conjugate gradient. But nevertheless, this is a reasonable number of iterations for MinRes. And so to summarize, like we have these 2 somewhat weird looking finite element spaces that actually have extra smoothness at non-corner vertices, but yet they're uniformly substable and they possess optimal approximation properties still, as long as you're using these corner split meshes. And so as long as you carefully select the vertex basis functions, you can develop an effective preconditioner. And you can argue somewhat similarly but it's slightly more complicated, but the Scott-Vogelius elements, which would be this velocity space without the C1 condition. Whoops, sorry. So if you have the velocity space without the C1 condition, and then you take its divergence to be the pressure space, this space is also uniformly stable as long as the degree is at least 4. And you also need another mild assumption on the mesh related to this not being too close to corner split, but now it applies at more vertices than just those corners. So again, like the future directions would be uniform and P preconditioners, which really just comes down to preconditioning this velocity space uniformly in P. We already have a uniform P preconditioner for the pressure space. Extending the method to 3D, where it's more relevant, and also using these sorts of elements to solve Malvier-Stokes equations instead of just Stokes. Because again, the pointwise divergence free property should be useful in many ways. So yeah, I will stop there and take questions on either part.
Any questions for the speaker?
We still have some finite element people in the audience. Should have some questions.
Yeah, I know this is not really the group's cup of tea.
It used to be a long time ago.
Yeah, I know I'm still old school.
No, this is very rigorous results. Good. I have a question. So one of the like in when you do Navier-Stokes, let's say even for the cavity, then you have to mesh differently. I assume that the same issues have to. I mean, there's no. I mean, the advection is a lower order derivative, so it shouldn't matter. But would affect the stability in any way? And I don't mean they just. Would they affect the preconditioner, for example? How would you do the precondition? Because now you have a non-symmetric system and so on. Would you split it? Because if you have time splitting, then you get other errors which are undesirable. Because now you get down to 10 to the minus 17. You don't want to pollute that.
Right. So I've not. Okay. So there's like multiple issues, right? Because the question is like, how do you, right? The linear system doesn't quite look like this anymore, or well, it does, but A now is not from. I mean, A also involves convective terms.
It's a non-linear system.
Yeah, but okay. Well, if you're using like Newton's method or something are we talking about time dependent or time independent?
Let's say time dependent to make it easy for you.
That makes it harder, but that's okay. I can still explain why that's non-trivial then, because then you have okay. Let's just let's just for the sake of, let's just assume you've already like linearized it in some way, but now you have like some mass matrix plus this thing, plus the small time times.
So,
this
so
thing.
for time, that's why I said for time dependent, you can linearize it around the previous state. You see?
Mhm.
Let's say with Adams-Basford, let's say, yeah.
Yeah, but the issue there is you have the mass matrix instead of the stiffness matrix, and preconditioning the mass matrix is much different.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the only issue there. I mean, I'm sure we can do it. It's just that's a difference that that like Mark has because like Marshall was working on that before he graduated. And so they were, that's where they were stuck, was doing, if you have like mass matrix plus some multiple of the stiffness matrix, can you do that?
Yeah.
To get something that's essentially the same as this.
Unless you use splitting, high order splitting for the Stokes operator. So you have the advection and then the other part, and I think that's the best way to implement it.
Yeah, I mean, another option you have is you could do some sort of semi-Lagrangian method, and then you just end up with Stokes again, because that gets rid of the convection.
Yeah, that's true too. That's true too. I have a nice semi-Lagrangian scheme we developed for high order methods. Dong Bin Shu actually developed a long time ago.
Yes, I've read that paper a few times.
And okay, so that method actually is very viable. The problem is at the boundaries. If you have an open, yeah, the problem is at the boundaries. What you do? Like
with the is your concern this corner split condition?
Not necessarily, but you have ghost points outside, so you don't know how the foot of the trajectory, because you go from it's a final value problem, right? So you track backwards, so you may end up outside the domain.
Yeah.
So that's a well-known problem so in open problems like in geophysics, in weather and so on, that's no problem because you never run out of real estate. But in bounded domains like the cavities that you show, it's a little tricky. I think there's the higher order split, because now there's like second, third order. I started and then Jishen and Germont have mathematized them. You can split the advection and the Stokes operator, pretty much with very, very small negligible splitting errors, and then basically you are independently operating on mass matrices and stiffness matrices. So
yeah, that would be ideal. Although but any convection at all would still introduce a problem that's not solved, at least for P version preconditioning, because yeah. No,
it will be a forcing term for the Stokes operator. Then you have it's like your Stokes. Yeah, that's like that comes as a forcing term.
Oh, so like as in you would treat that explicitly.
Yeah, semi-implicit. Yeah, these are all semi-implicit. Doesn't make sense to do. Yeah, if you do it implicitly, but it doesn't really make sense to do it implicitly.
Yeah, then that would be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, IMX type things, yeah, which have been advanced quite a bit actually. Sigal Gottlieb has good methods also on this.
Yeah. Yeah, the main thing we're pushing towards, well, we're doing linear elasticity first, because I made that comment about the Scott-Vogelius elements, you can say something about, like if I just discretize nearly incompressible linear elasticity in the primal form, just with the usual C0 elements, you get convergence of the stresses that you would not know from previous arguments because of this insubstability. But yeah, I think we're primarily motivated to do 3D because that seems to be the question everyone asks at conferences.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, 3D and nonlinear problems are exactly what my NSF postdoc proposal are about.
Yeah. Data, you're muted. Yeah.
Any more questions for the speaker?
Charlie, thanks for taking the time today.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie. And with that, we'll end our seminar for this week. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and have a good weekend. Thank you.